The rain was relentless, slashing the Boston pavement like tiny knives of ice. The city's lights blurred through the soaked windshield of Nathan Harris's delivery van. He'd just finished his last drop-off, a package to a closed art studio in Back Bay, and was heading home to his modest one-bedroom apartment in Dorchester when he saw it. A thick column of smoke. It wasn't distant. It was just across the street. Nathan's breath caught as he slammed the brakes. Heart instantly racing. Flames licked out from the fourth-floor windows of a brick apartment complex. People were screaming below. A man on a bike was already dialing 911. A woman across the street was crying, "There's still people up there." Without thinking, Nathan threw the van into park, yanked open the door, and sprinted into the chaos. The entrance to the building was partially collapsed, but not enough to stop him. The heat hit him like a furnace the moment he pushed through the glass. "Doors, help, please!" The voice came from above. Nathan didn't hesitate. He bolted up the stairwell, his boots pounding the steps, smoke choking his lungs with each breath. He passed the second floor, then the third. When he reached the fourth floor, he saw the door at the end of the hall glowing orange from inside. He kicked it in. A wall of smoke nearly knocked him off his feet. Crouching low, he moved in, his eyes searching the thick gray air. The fire was already eating the kitchen, flames spitting out from the stove. Then, movement. A woman coughing, dragging a boy by the hand. The boy looked about 14, face streaked with soot and fear. "Hey, this way," Nathan shouted. The woman turned toward his voice when stumbling. "We can't, he's hurt." Nathan rushed forward. He saw now. The boy's ankle was twisted, possibly broken. Without waiting, Nathan lifted the boy over his shoulder and grabbed the woman's hand. "Don't let go," he growled. "We're getting out of here." They made it halfway down the stairs before part of the ceiling above cracked and fell behind them. The woman screamed. Nathan tightened his grip and didn't stop moving. On the ground floor, emergency lights flashed through the smoke. Firefighters were rushing in. Nathan shoved the front doors open with his shoulder, stumbling out into the cold rain. The woman collapsed on the sidewalk, coughing. The boy was unconscious in Nathan's arms. Medics swarmed them. But Nathan didn't stay. Before anyone could speak to him, before the first news cameras arrived, he vanished back into the night. Soaked, burned on one arm, heart pounding, but invisible. He didn't want attention, not anymore, not since 5 years ago. The next morning, Nathan sat in silence at his kitchen table, a cup of black coffee growing cold in his hands. The headline on his phone read, "Mysterious Hero Saves Mother and Son from Apartment Fire." There was a blurry photo of the building, no name, no face, just a man in his 40s who had disappeared before anyone could thank him. Nathan locked his phone and leaned back in the chair, staring at the peeling ceiling above. His shoulder still ached. His lungs still burned. But something inside him, something long dead, had flickered again. Then the phone rang. An unknown number. He hesitated, then picked up. "Nathan?" A woman's voice asked, soft but strained. "This is Amanda Taylor, from last night." He froze. She continued. "I know you didn't want to be found, but I need to see you, please." Nathan said nothing. "I need to tell you what really happened that night," Amanda whispered. A pause. Then, "It wasn't an accident." Click. The call ended, and Nathan Harris, who had buried everything inside for half a decade, suddenly realized he hadn't saved just any woman from that fire. He'd walked straight into something much bigger. Nathan almost turned off his phone after the call. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. After all, he had done his part. He'd saved 2 lives, risked his own, and didn't owe anyone anything. But something about that voice, the subtle tremble woven into her words, clung to his mind like smoke in his lungs. Amanda Taylor hadn't been calling to say thank you. Her tone had been urgent, frightened, as if the fire he'd pulled her from wasn't the real danger. That afternoon, Nathan found himself outside a nondescript cafe near Beacon Hill, a place that felt safely anonymous. He'd chosen the location carefully, watching the street through the fogged window for nearly 20 minutes before she arrived. Amanda stepped in wearing oversized sunglasses and a hoodie pulled low, her posture tight, eyes scanning every face like a hunted animal. She spotted him almost immediately and approached with a nervous gait that made him sit up, straighter. She sat across from him without removing her sunglasses. There was no greeting, no pleasantries, just a quiet exhale, and then a whisper. "I didn't know if you'd come," she said, voice low. Nathan leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I didn't know either." Silence fell between them for a moment, broken only by the distant clink of cups behind the counter. Amanda reached for the cup of tea she'd ordered but didn't drink. Her hands trembled slightly as she cupped it. "I need to tell you something," she said, her throat tightening. "That fire, it wasn't an accident." Nathan's brow furrowed, but he didn't speak. He let her go on. Amanda took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was steadier, but raw. "I lit it. I set the fire." The words landed with the weight of bricks. Nathan's jaw clenched, but he didn't react outwardly. She continued, her gaze hidden behind dark lenses. "I didn't know you'd be there. I didn't expect anyone to come. It wasn't supposed to be like that. I needed out. I was desperate. That apartment, that life, every part of it was a prison." Nathan finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "You had your son in there." Amanda nodded slowly, shame rising like heat in her face. "I know. And if that makes me a monster, fine. But I swear to you, I waited until he was near the door. I thought we'd be out before the flames spread. I didn't plan it to go so fast." She took off her glasses then, and for the first time Nathan saw her eyes. Red, swollen, hollow. Not the eyes of someone relieved to be alive, but of someone who had escaped something worse than fire. "There's more to it," she said, in her voice breaking. "But I can't tell you everything. Not yet. All I'm asking is, don't tell anyone. Not yet. Caleb doesn't know. And he can't. He thinks we just had bad luck. He doesn't know what I did or why I did it." Nathan leaned back, overwhelmed. His instincts screamed at him to walk away. This wasn't his problem. This woman was a stranger who had done something reckless, maybe even criminal. But then again, she wasn't just anyone. She was someone who'd looked out of a burning building in terror and begged for her son's life. She was someone who had whispered her confession to him not out of arrogance, but from a place of raw, unfiltered pain. "I should report this," he finally said, his voice dry. "You know that, right?" Amanda looked down. "I know." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," she whispered, "you saved us. And that means you deserve to know what you really pulled us from." Nathan didn't answer. He stared out the window, watching the people pass by in the drizzle, all of them living lives untouched by this quiet storm unraveling across the table from him. And in that moment, he realized something terrible. He wasn't going to walk away. Nathan didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, as the dim light of Boston filtered through the blinds. The conversation with Amanda played in his mind on a constant loop, dragging him through waves of doubt and discomfort. The scent of smoke, the crackle of flames, and the weight of that boy in his arms. It all returned with frightening clarity. But beneath the unease, something deeper stirred. Not fear, not even anger. It was memory. Memory that had waited 5 long years to resurface. His daughter, Lily, had died in a fire. It was different from Amanda's blaze, an electrical, short in her bedroom heater on a snowy January night. Nathan had been asleep in the next room. By the time he reached her, the smoke was too thick, the flames too fast. He still remembered the sound of his wife's scream when she realized what was happening. That night had carved him hollow, leaving behind a man who walked and breathed purr, but no longer lived. He'd quit teaching, sold the house, let the marriage dissolve into silence. Since then, his world had shrunk to deliveries, empty apartments, or the occasional dinner in front of a muted television. That morning, as sunlight struggled through the gray sky, Nathan dressed without thinking and walked for hours. He didn't have a destination, but his steps carried him toward the city's parks, places he hadn't visited in years. Was in Boston Common, near the pond where children fed ducks in the spring, that he saw him again. Caleb, the boy from the fire. The teenager sat on a bench, legs drawn up, his crutches leaning against the side. His ankle was bandaged, but he didn't seem to notice the discomfort. He was watching the water, lost in thought. Nathan approached cautiously, unsure of what he was even doing. "Hey," he said, gently, when he was close enough. Caleb turned, recognition lighting his face for a brief moment before confusion set in. "You're the guy from the fire," Nathan nodded. He expected the boy to ask questions, maybe even run. But instead, Caleb simply shifted over, making room on the bench. "You disappeared before anyone could thank you," he said quietly. "I don't like cameras," Nathan replied. They sat in silence for a while, watching the breeze ripple across the pond. Nathan studied the boy, his thin frame, the way he wrung his hands when he thought no one was looking. And then something struck him, the tilt of the head, the way he stared out into the world like he was trying to make sense of it all. Lily used to do that, especially after her mother and he had argued. She'd sit on the porch, legs swinging, a face tight with a silent wisdom far too old for her 10 years. "You remind me of someone," Nathan said after a long pause. Caleb glanced sideways. "Is that good or bad?" Nathan smiled faintly. "Good." She was brave. The boy looked away again, the corners of his mouth tightening. "Things haven't been easy," he said. "Not for me. Not for my mom." Nathan hesitated, the memory of Amanda's confession still sharp in his mind. "She told me a little," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I know you've both been through a lot." Caleb nodded, slowly. "She's trying. I know she is. But sometimes, it feels like there's stuff she's not telling me, like I'm always half in the dark." Nathan didn't respond. He couldn't. That silence between them spoke more than any words could. They were two people haunted by fire, not just its flames, but everything it took with it. And in that quiet hour, Nathan made a decision he didn't fully understand. He wasn't going to abandon them, not yet. The hotel Amanda had found was one of those forgotten places tucked between a liquor store and a laundromat in the outer neighborhoods of Boston. The kind of place people stayed when they didn't want to be noticed. Nathan hesitated before knocking on the door of room 217, wondering if he was crossing a line, if perhaps by returning he was anchoring himself to a past he was trying to escape. But the image of Caleb sitting alone on that bench lingered in his mind, fragile, exposed, waiting for answers that might never come. He knocked. Amanda opened the door almost immediately. She looked different than she had at the cafe, less guarded, but more exhausted. Her hair was damp, as if she had just showered, and she wore a sweatshirt that hung loosely on her frame. The room behind her was dimly lit, cluttered with takeout containers, and filled with the heavy silence of uncertainty. She stepped aside without a word, letting him in. They sat opposite each other at the small table by the window. Caleb wasn't there. He was still at a doctor's appointment, she said. Amanda folded her arms across her chest as she spoke, her gaze often drifting toward the carpet or the rain outside. Bit by bit, the pieces of her story came out, not in dramatic bursts, but in halting confessions, each word weighted with hesitation. She had been with a man named Raymond Kessler, a wealthy contractor known in certain political circles. His charm had disarmed her quickly, but once she moved in, the reality settled like frost on glass. He was controlling, volatile, and frighteningly persuasive. Amanda tried to leave twice before him, but each time, he found her. Each time, he made her pay. The police reports never led anywhere. Complaints were dismissed. "He has friends," she murmured, her voice hollow. "In uniforms, on payrolls. You can't run from someone who can make you disappear with a phone call." Nathan listened, his fingers laced together, jaw tight. He didn't press for details. He could see how much it cost her to speak at all. She described how, in the weeks before the fire, the violence escalated. She was certain he would kill her. She had no plan, no resources, just fear and a flickering sense of desperation. The fire had been her escape, her reset button. "If you hadn't shown up," she began, but couldn't finish. They were silent for a while after that. Rain tapped steadily on the window pane, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but filled with all the things left unsaid. Then Amanda looked up, her eyes glassy. "I'm not asking you to forgive what I did," she said, "but I don't have anyone else. I don't trust anyone else." Nathan looked at her, really looked. Beneath the mess of decisions and fear, she was a mother, a woman trying to protect her child the only way she knew how, and for reasons he couldn't yet articulate. He felt that maybe, just maybe, his path wasn't done here. He started visiting them regularly, bringing warm meals, helping Caleb with schoolwork, running errands Amanda was too afraid to leave for. They spoke more, not just about the past, but about the small moments in between. Caleb's love for sketching, Amanda's old dream of being a social worker, Nathan's brief stint as a literature teacher. None of them mentioned the fire anymore, but it lingered, just beneath the surface like embers under ash. Over time, the bonds between them grew, not out of comfort, but necessity. Three broken people, leaning on each other, trying to believe they could rebuild. And yet, even in those quiet moments, Nathan couldn't shake one thought. When you save someone from fire, you never truly know what else you're pulling out with them. Nathan found himself falling into an unspoken routine. Every other afternoon, he'd show up at the worn-down hotel with takeout containers and cautious optimism. Amanda would open the door, sometimes offering a tired smile, sometimes nothing at all, and Caleb would be there, always quiet, always observant. The boy didn't say much, but Nathan sensed him listening, studying. He reminded Nathan of his students from before, the ones who had lived through too much too soon and learned to make themselves small in response to chaos. Nathan never pressed him to speak, but one day, something changed. It was a Saturday, morning gray and windless, when Nathan picked Caleb up to go for a bike ride around Franklin Park. Amanda had insisted it would be good for him, and though Caleb had hesitated, he eventually nodded. The boy's ankle was healing well, and the doctor had cleared him for light activity. Nathan brought two bikes, one his own, the other borrowed, and they pedaled in silence for nearly 20 minutes before stopping under an old oak tree, breath visible in the cool air. They sat on a bench near the trail, both sipping from water bottles, neither speaking for a while. Then, without prompting, Caleb finally broke the silence, his voice almost hesitant, like the words had been waiting for permission. "I miss him sometimes," he said, eyes fixed on a patch of moss beneath his feet. "My dad, even after everything." Nathan didn't respond immediately. He let the boy's confession settle, feeling the weight of it. Grief and fear often come entangled, impossible to separate. He knew that better than anyone. Caleb looked up, his face pale but composed. "I know he wasn't good. I saw things, heard things. I knew he scared my mom, but he was still my dad. Sometimes I think I remember the good parts, like when he used to read to me before bed, or teach me how to make paper airplanes. But then other times, I remember the shouting. The way." She flinched when he walked into a room. Nathan studied the boy's face. his guarded expressions, the way he fought to make sense of memories that contradicted each other. "It's okay to remember both," he said, finally. "It doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." Caleb nodded, almost grateful for the validation. He glanced at Nathan then, something more serious darkening his expression. "The night of the fire," he said slowly. "I think I saw something I wasn't supposed to." Nathan felt his body go still, his attention sharpening. "We were getting ready to leave. My mom was packing stuff in a hurry. She was scared. I asked her what was going on, but she just kept saying we had to go. Then, I saw her put something inside the oven. A towel, maybe. I don't know exactly, but she lit a match after that." His voice broke slightly, not from emotion, but from confusion. "She told me to grab my backpack and run. I did. I didn't ask questions. But I saw." Nathan tried to remain composed, though his thoughts surged like a rising tide. Amanda had admitted to setting the fire, but now he saw the moment through a different lens, through Caleb's eyes. This wasn't just a desperate escape. It was a trauma buried under secrets, one that Caleb carried in silence because he didn't know what was true, what was betrayal, and what was survival. Nathan placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "Whatever happened," he said, voice steady, "you did the right thing. You got out. You're here. That means something." But even as he spoke the words, doubt unfurled inside him. Amanda had held back details. Caleb's account wasn't just a child's misinterpretation. It was a crack in the version she'd offered, and cracks had a way of spreading. Nathan realized something chilling in that moment. There were still flames burning between the truth and the lie, and the boy was standing right in the middle. Nathan didn't go to the hotel that night. Instead, he walked for hours under the orange haze of the city's streetlights, trying to make sense of the conflict burning inside him. Amanda's words had sounded desperate, honest in their fear. But Caleb's quiet revelation had shifted, something fundamental. It wasn't just that Amanda had lied by omission. It was that she had let her son live in a constructed truth, a fragile version of events built on survival and silence. And Nathan, now entangled in their world, couldn't pretend he was just a bystander anymore. The next afternoon, he returned to room 217 with 2 paper bags of groceries and a decision weighing heavily in his chest. Amanda opened the door with a familiar half-smile, but it faded quickly when she saw the tension in his eyes. Caleb wasn't there. He was downstairs at the vending machine, she explained. Nathan stepped inside without a word and set the bags on the counter. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he turned, arms crossed, his voice low and deliberate. "He remembers," Nathan said. "The oven, the match, the moment before the flames." Amanda froze, the color draining from her face. She didn't try to deny it. Instead, she sat down slowly at the edge of the bed, her hands resting in her lap, shoulders caving in as though the weight of her choices had finally caught up to her. "I never wanted him to know," she whispered, staring at the threadbare carpet. "I thought if I kept him safe, if I kept things simple, it would be enough. But he saw more than I realized." Nathan watched her carefully. "Why did you lie to him?" Amanda exhaled shakily, the sound somewhere between a sigh and a sob. "Because I was afraid. Afraid he'd hate me. Afraid he'd think I was like him. And mostly, because once I started lying, it felt safer to keep going than to stop." The silence between them thickened. Amanda's voice cracked as she continued, no longer defending herself, but unraveling. "Raymond told me more than once that if I ever tried to leave, he'd take Caleb from me. Said I was unstable, unfit. He had connections to back it up. I tried to report him, tried to build a case, but the more I tried, the more he closed in. That night, I knew he was coming. I had hours, maybe less. I panicked. I needed a way out." She looked up at Nathan then, her eyes raw with something between shame and defiance. "I made the fire look like an accident. I never meant for it to get out of control. But it did. And if you hadn't shown up, We wouldn't be here. I know that. Nathan didn't move, didn't speak for a long time. He thought of Lily, of her bedroom, her drawings on the wall, the smell of smoke that had never left his memory. He thought of how, for years, he blamed himself for not saving her. And now here he was, trying to make sense of another fire, another child, another mother trying to rewrite the past in the ashes of a mistake. You could go to prison, he said finally, his voice steady. You know that. Amanda nodded. I know. You put him in danger. I know. But he still loves you. Nathan added, softer now. And he deserves to know the truth. Tears welled in Amanda's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She sat upright, her voice steadier than before. So tell me, Nathan, what do I do now? He looked at her for a long moment, then lowered himself into the chair across from her. We start by not lying anymore. It wasn't a solution, it wasn't even a plan, but it was a line, drawn in truth, however painful. And in that moment, Amanda nodded, not with relief, but with the quiet understanding that from here on, every step forward would be on uncertain ground. There was no more running, no more hiding behind smoke. The game of truth had begun. Nathan didn't sleep well for days. The more he tried to rationalize Amanda's desperation, the more the line between right and wrong began to blur in his mind. He had spent most of his life believing that truth was a duty, that honesty and justice were twin pillars of any decent society. But now he found himself tangled in a reality where justice wasn't clean, and truth could destroy more than it healed. Amanda had broken the law, undeniably, but she had also survived something no one should endure. And Caleb, caught in the middle, was the one with the most to lose if the truth came to light the wrong way. One morning, after dropping off a package in South Boston, Nathan took a detour to the community center where he had once volunteered. There, he found Evelyn Monroe, a social worker in her early 50s, who had worked closely with troubled teens during Nathan's years as a teacher. She recognized him immediately, and though surprised by his sudden appearance, welcomed him with a warm smile and a gentle concern that hadn't changed with time. They spoke in her office, behind closed doors. Nathan presented the situation as a hypothetical. No names, no addresses. He spoke carefully, omitting key details but conveying the essence. A woman trapped in an abusive relationship, failed by the system, pushed to an extreme act as a means of escape. He watched Evelyn closely as she listened, her eyes narrowing, with a mixture of empathy and exhaustion. This isn't the first time I've heard a story like that, she said finally, leaning back in her chair. The justice system can be especially cruel to women in those situations. They're asked why they didn't leave earlier, why they didn't report it sooner. The truth is, when someone's holding your life and your child's, like a switchblade, logic disappears. You just survive. Nathan nodded, silently, absorbing her words. Evelyn continued. But if the fire was deliberate, even out of desperation, she's at risk, especially if the man she fled has power. The law isn't designed for nuance. It's designed for clean answers. And this woman's life, it sounds anything but clean. She refuses to go to the police, Nathan said. She's convinced he'll find her if she enters the system. Evelyn sighed, rubbing her temples. Then she needs legal help, quietly. There are nonprofits that specialize in these cases. Women in hiding, name changes, relocation programs. But she has to be willing. You can't force someone into protection. They have to trust it. Nathan left the center, feeling both reassured and burdened. There were paths forward for Amanda, but none of them were easy, and all of them required her to confront her past more openly than she had so far. That evening, he returned to the hotel and shared what he had learned. Amanda listened in, silence, eyes downcast, arms crossed tightly across her chest. I'm not going to some lawyer's office just to be told it was my fault, she said at last. They don't understand what he's capable of. I believe you, Nathan said gently. But living like this, hiding, waiting, for him to show up isn't safety. It's just a slower form of fear. Amanda looked at him then, and for a brief moment, something shifted behind her eyes. Not defiance, not denial, just exhaustion. She wanted peace. That much was clear. But peace, for her, meant disappearing. Not trusting a system that had let her down too many times. "I'll think about it," she murmured, though Nathan knew it wasn't a promise. As the night fell over the city and the streets emptied, into silence, Nathan stood by the window of his apartment staring out into the darkness. The law offered rules. Compassion offered mercy. But somewhere between the two, a woman and her son were trying to stay alive. And Nathan wasn't sure which side he was standing on anymore. It started with a shadow. At first, Nathan didn't pay attention to the dark van parked across the street from the hotel, thinking it was just another delivery vehicle or maybe a guest who preferred privacy. But then he saw it again, and again, always the same. Matte black paint, tinted windows, engine running just long enough to draw suspicion before fading back into silence. Nathan didn't believe in coincidences anymore, not after everything Amanda had told him. The van was watching, or more accurately, someone inside it was. He didn't mention it to Amanda right away. She was already on edge, checking the locks twice, pulling the curtains shut even in daylight. But when Caleb whispered one evening that he had seen a man standing across the street at night, just watching, not moving, Nathan knew the time for silence was over. Amanda's face drained of color as he described the van. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with her phone, as if to call someone, then stopped, realizing there was no one to call, no one she trusted, no one who wouldn't lead him straight to her. Panic set in fast. Amanda insisted they couldn't stay in the hotel anymore. "It's not safe. He found us once before. He'll do it again." Her voice cracked with the kind of fear that came from memory, not imagination. Nathan didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. The look in her eyes said everything. There was no time to wait for legal programs or paperwork. They had to disappear. Now. Nathan made a choice that night. He offered something he hadn't touched in years. The old chalet on the outskirts of town. The one he had shared with his ex-wife during better times. Since Lily's death, it had stood mostly empty, preserved like a time capsule of another life. But it was isolated, surrounded by woods, and it still had a functioning security system. Amanda hesitated at first, too much trust too quickly. But desperation eroded hesitation. She nodded, and by sunrise, they were gone. They drove separately to avoid suspicion. Nathan led the way, his eyes glued to the rearview mirror, scanning every turn, every vehicle that lingered too long. The chalet sat just beyond a winding trail of pine and gravel, flanked by fog-covered hills and the distant echo of train whistles. Amanda stepped inside first, holding Caleb's hand tightly, and paused at the threshold. There was something sacred about the silence of the place, as if it had been waiting, not just for them, but for a new purpose. They unpacked little: clothes, sketchbooks, canned goods. Nathan walked through the rooms, closing each blind, testing each lock, restoring the alarms. The house was modest but solid. Caleb took the spare room, Amanda the guest suite. Nathan kept to the study, where dust still covered old lesson plans and framed photos of a life he had tried to forget. For the first time in weeks, Amanda slept. Not deeply, but without flinching at every creak. Caleb explored the wooded backyard, sketching trees and birds, his silence softening into something like calm. Nathan watched them from the kitchen window, a strange mix of comfort and dread in his chest. He knew this peace was temporary, that whoever was watching hadn't stopped just because they moved. But for now, the fire was behind them. The world was quiet, and somewhere just beyond the trees, danger was learning how to wait. The days in the chalet settled into a rhythm that was fragile but comforting. Amanda cooked in silence, often humming to herself as if trying to remind her body what peace sounded like. Caleb returned to his drawings, filling pages with twisted trees and still lakes that mirrored the dense forest surrounding them. Nathan spent most of his time restoring what had fallen into disuse, replacing old light bulbs, sanding down, doors that had swollen from moisture, and mending a long-forgotten porch swing that creaked like a voice too long ignored. None of them spoke much about the past. It lingered, but they had all silently agreed to let the quiet hold them. At least for now. One cold morning, with mist crawling low over the earth, Caleb was exploring the attic when he stumbled across a small wooden chest, locked and half buried beneath a tarp. Curious, he dragged it toward the light and pried it open with trembling fingers. Inside were yellowing envelopes, tied together with a brittle ribbon. The ink on the addresses faded but still legible. They were letters, dozens of them. He sat cross-legged on the dusty floor and began to read. They were from Nathan. Each letter was addressed to Lily, written in the months following her death. Some were short, others long, some angry, some unbearably tender. But all of them echoed the voice of a man shattered by loss, trying to hold on to something he could never touch again. Caleb read each one with reverence, as though unearthing the truth of someone who had never spoken it aloud. He carried them downstairs, cradling the bundle like a fragile relic. Amanda was at the dining table, sipping coffee with unfocused eyes when Caleb placed the letters in front of her without a word. She looked down, confused at first, then lifted one and began to read. It took her only a few lines to understand. Nathan, who had always seemed so composed, so deliberate, had poured his broken soul onto paper in the solitude of this house. She read in silence, page after page, until the mug beside her had gone cold. When Nathan entered the room and saw her there, hunched over the table with his past exposed before her, he froze. For a moment he looked like a man caught in a fire all over again, unable to move, unsure what could still be saved. "I found them in the attic," Caleb said softly. "I thought she should know." Amanda looked up at Nathan, her eyes damp but steady. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she stood and walked to him, holding one of the letters in her hand. "You wrote these to her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "After the funeral. I didn't know what else to do. It felt like if I stopped talking to her, even in writing, it would mean she was really gone." Amanda held the letter to her chest. "You didn't just save me and Caleb. You saved yourself too. You just didn't know it yet." Something shifted between them then. Not romance, not gratitude, but a raw recognition. Two broken souls, carrying invisible burns, acknowledging each other's pain without pretending it could be healed. In that moment, Amanda didn't see Nathan as a rescuer or a man who might expose her secrets. She saw him for what he truly was, a father who had lost everything and still chose to protect someone else's child. That night, as snow began to fall outside the chalet, Amanda placed the letters back in the chest and locked it again. She didn't return them to the attic. She left them on the mantel where they belonged, not as a symbol of grief, but of something slowly rebuilding in the silence. And for the first time in 5 years, Nathan slept without waking from dreams of fire. The snow continued for days, blanketing the chalet and the surrounding woods in silence. For Amanda, it brought a sense of hiding in plain sight, as though the world had paused just long enough for her to imagine something close to freedom. But Nathan knew better. He had lived too long with the knowledge that peace is always temporary. Still, he allowed the stillness to take root, if only to give Amanda and Caleb space to breathe. There were fewer nightmares now, fewer anxious glances at windows and shadows. Yet beneath that quiet, something else began to stir, an understanding that their time there was running out. Amanda was the first to bring it up, standing by the fireplace one evening with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "I can't stay here forever," she said softly. not looking at Nathan. This isn't life. It's shelter. And eventually, someone's going to come knocking. Nathan sat on the couch, legs stretched toward the fire, arms crossed. I know. She hesitated. I've been thinking about what you said. About help. Legal help. The name, change programs. The protection services. He looked up. There was no fear in her voice this time. Only fatigue wrapped in resolve. I'm ready, she said. Not because I trust the system. I don't. But because I trust you. And Caleb deserves a future that doesn't involve hiding in borrowed houses. In the days that followed, Nathan contacted Evelyn Monroe. Again. Through her, they navigated a labyrinth of discrete legal resources, organizations designed to help women like Amanda disappear and reemerge with new identities, new histories, new chances. Amanda worked through the paperwork cautiously, always with one eye on Caleb. The hardest part, she admitted, wasn't changing her name or forging a new life. It was leaving behind the version of herself that had survived so much. It feels like I'm killing someone, she told Nathan one afternoon. But maybe that version of me needs to die. With help from the legal team, Amanda and Caleb were granted entry into a protection program under aliases. Vermont was chosen as their destination, quiet, small-town life where no one asked too many questions. Amanda would become Emily Palmer. Caleb would become Adam. They would have a new address, a new past, and, for the first time, a real chance at stability. Amanda even began researching community colleges nearby, expressing interest in psychology and trauma support. I think I want to help people like me, she said one night, staring into the fire. Like us. The departure was quiet, no tears, no goodbyes. Just a calm, early morning when Nathan drove them to the outskirts of town, where a car waited to take them the rest of the way. Caleb hugged him first, tight, quiet, fierce. Amanda followed, slipping a sealed envelope into Nathan's coat pocket without a word. Then she stepped back, her eyes fixed on him for a long moment. You were the first man who ever protected me without asking for anything, she said. That will stay with me. As the car drove away, Nathan stood motionless on the gravel road, snowflakes catching in his hair. He didn't wave. He didn't cry. He simply watched until the red taillights vanished into the trees. When he returned to the chalet that evening, the silence felt heavier than usual. He sat by the fireplace, unfolded the envelope Amanda had left Eli, and read the letter inside. It was brief, written in her uneven handwriting. You didn't just save us from a fire. You saved me from myself. Thank you for not walking away. Nathan folded the letter and placed it gently into the chest of old letters, next to those he had written to Lily. He stared at the flames dancing in the hearth, and for the first time, the warmth didn't feel like a memory. It felt like something beginning. The winter passed slowly, its days stitched together by quiet routines and long walks Nathan took through the forest behind the chalet. Without Amanda and Caleb, the house returned to its original stillness. But something within Nathan had shifted irreversibly. Where once the silence had felt like punishment, it now carried a sense of earned peace. An echo of something he had helped rebuild, not just in others, but within himself. He resumed reading again, picking up books he'd abandoned years ago, and eventually found his way back to the city's schools, volunteering in classrooms that reminded him why he'd once believed in young minds. It was on a Thursday afternoon, just as he was leaving a middle school in Roxbury after helping a group of students rehearse for a debate competition, that his phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something told him to answer. He stepped outside into the pale sun, pressed the phone to his ear, and said hello. Nathan, came a voice, cautious but warm. It's me, Caleb. For a long second, Nathan couldn't speak. He leaned against the brick wall, heart tightening in a way he hadn't expected. Caleb's voice had deepened slightly, but it still carried the same quiet thoughtfulness. I hope it's okay I'm calling, Caleb continued. I wanted you to know we're doing good. Mom, Emily, she started taking classes at the community college. She's studying counseling. She helps other women now. And I'm going to a real school again. There's this art teacher who keeps telling me I should submit something to a state competition. It's not the same as before, but it's better. Nathan swallowed hard. A strange, bittersweet smile creeping onto his face. I'm glad to hear that, he said, voice thick with emotion he didn't bother hiding. You deserve better. There was a pause, then Caleb spoke again. You were the first person who ever showed me what it felt like to be safe. Not just protected, safe. That's something I won't forget. I wanted to tell you that you feel like my second father. Nathan closed his eyes. The words landed in a place that had once been scorched and abandoned, but now pulsed with something alive. He didn't try to respond right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch for a moment, filled with more meaning than words could hold. Thank you, he said finally. That means more than you know. Before hanging up, Caleb added one last thing. Mom says you should visit sometime, if you ever want to. We're up near Brattleboro. It's not much, but it's peaceful. Nathan promised he would think about it, and he meant it. That evening, back at the chalet, he took out the old photograph of Lily, the one with her riding a bike down their street, hair wild, eyes laughing, and placed it on the mantel next to Amanda's letter. He stared at it for a long time, then whispered, I told you I'd find a way to make it right. Days later, he returned to the school in Dorchester, not as a volunteer this time, but to sign up as a part-time mentor for students in crisis. He met with the principal, filled out forms, and agreed to sit in on guidance sessions. It wasn't a full return to teaching, but it was a start. The man who once believed his life had ended in flames now stepped quietly into a new beginning, no longer running from the past but carrying it with him, reshaped, redefined. And this time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like purpose.